I want to welcome you to today's symposium, which is titled Stories from Libya and Beyond, The People and Politics of Asbestos. My name is Steve Schwartz. I'm a faculty member in the Communication Studies Department, and I'll be hosting our event today. As many of you know, this symposium is part of a series of events called Landscape of Asbestos, Libya and Beyond. The series is a diverse range of events, from public lectures to photography exhibits to documentary films made by Libby High School students. Through these multiple media, we hope to raise public awareness about the scope and severity of the hazard of asbestos and amplify the voices of those who are speaking out about this problem. We believe our lineup today will do exactly that. The we that is behind this project is a tremendous collaboration of people from the CARD, the Center for Asbestos-Related Disease Clinic in Libby, the Missoula Art Museum, and several departments at the University of Montana. It has been an exceptionally rewarding experience to work with all of these folks, and I want to publicly acknowledge them today for all of their hard work during the past year and a half. There's Helen Clark from the CARD Clinic in Libby, from the university, Ann Cook, Helena Hoas, Dixie McLaughlin, Liz Putnam, Holly Truitt, and myself, and from the Art Museum, Steve Gluckert, Laura Millen, and Renee Taffy. I especially want to thank Laura and Steve. Their decision to bring Bill Ravanesi's exhibit to Missoula propelled all of this forward. Their commitment to this issue has been unwavering, and we would not be here today without their belief in the significance of the issue for this region. Bill's exhibit, The Breathtaking, The Landscape and Biography of Asbestos, is currently on display at the Missoula Art Museum, as well as two other exhibits that are specifically about Libby. And I want to urge all of you to take the time to give that exhibit the time that it needs, to look at all the pictures, to read the excellent description and narrative that is provided by Paul Brodeur and others, to really understand the problem of asbestos. You need to see that exhibit. I also want to thank many of the supporters of today's symposium. They include the Art Museum, the St. Patrick's Hospital Foundation, the White Lung Association, as well as several UM programs, the Department of Biomedical and Pharmaceutical Sciences, the Center for Environmental Health Sciences, the Department of Communication Studies, the Environmental Studies Program, School of Journalism, National Rural Bioethics Project in the Department of Psychology, and the Provost's Faculty Development Committee. For me personally, today's symposium is the fulfillment of an implicit promise. It was about 2 years ago that I went up to Libby and had the opportunity to sit around the kitchen table at Gayla Benefield's house on the banks of the Kootenai River. I was interviewing her as part of my research on the public discourse surrounding the asbestos situation in Libby. And as we got to the end of our interview, I asked her, now that you've given me all of this, Gayla, what can I do for you? How can I give back or do something to help the people of Libby? And she, trotted off back to her office and pulled out this monograph or catalog of Bill Ravanesi's exhibit. And she said, why don't you see if you can get this exhibit to Montana? So I drove back to Missoula and looked around the university and around different places here in the community and tried to find a space for it, and took it to Steve Gluckert. And eventually, after some soul searching and thinking, we made it happen. And with the help of all the people that I mentioned earlier, we were able to keep that promise. From the perspective of someone who studies communication, though, promises are sort of funny things. They complicate how we think about words and actions and the relationship between them. A promise is an action that can only be taken through words, through communication. But to fulfill that promise, you also have to act. Right? We say that we want action, not words, but we also say that when it comes right down to it, all a man's got is his word. Unfortunately, the history of the asbestos hazard is a history that is littered with the shards of broken promises. The implicit and explicit promises made to workers, their families, and the public at large have been broken time and time again by industry, by occupational safety and public health agencies, and by elected officials at all levels. No one can speak more authoritatively on this issue than our first two speakers, Paul Brodeur and Andrew Schneider. Paul Brodeur was a staff writer at The New Yorker for almost 40 years. He wrote a pioneering piece about the asbestos health hazard for that magazine, and during the next 20 years, he was the author of several series of articles and 4 books on the subject, including Expendable Americans and Outrageous Misconduct, the Asbestos Industry on Trial. One of his series won the National Magazine Award for 1973. In addition, his work has alerted the nation to the depletion of the ozone layer and the harmful effects of microwave radiation and power frequency electromagnetic fields. The United Nations Environment Program named him to its Global 500 Roll of Honor for outstanding environmental achievement. Today we'll hear Paul Brodeur speak first, and then we'll introduce Andrew Schneider, and Andrew will speak, and then we'll field questions and answers. Well, they'll field the questions and give you the answers after both of them have spoken. If you're interested in asking questions as well, please, if you're in the back, feel free to go to the microphone that's just off center over here, and we'll also have a microphone as well in the corner. The Missoula Community Access Television will be taping our events, so we want to make sure that they get the sound for those. So, our first speaker today, Mr. Paul Brodeur.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for coming out on such a beautiful spring day. I thought I'd talk a bit this morning about my early work in asbestos, in writing about asbestos disease, because curiously enough, the very first piece I wrote, entitled The Magic Mineral, which was published in The New Yorker in 1968, the lead was suggested to me by a dear friend and mentor of mine, Leonard Wallace Robinson, who lived for many years in this city with his wife, Patricia Gerticke, who's here, the poet, who has taught for many years at the university. Leonard suggested that because asbestos was really unknown to people, people did not understand what it was 35 years ago, that I better start the piece out with some anecdotes which would ground people in what the stuff was before getting into its hazardous components. And he gave me an anecdote from his childhood. He grew up in Malden, Massachusetts, 2 towns away from me on the outskirts of Boston. So this is how I began the piece, and the first anecdote is straight out of Leonard Robinson. Back in the 1920s, when the word asbestos frequently appeared in large block letters on the fireproof drop curtains that closed off the proscenium openings of theater stages, it was customary in certain parts of the country for youngsters attending Saturday matinee performances of Charlie's Aunt, or The Cabbage Patch, or Mrs. Wiggs, or The Vagabond King, to greet the raising of the asbestos curtain with the chant, "All schoolboys eat stewed tomatoes on Saturday." This was not, of course, an exercise in mnemonics, but an expression of youthful exuberance, and to a lesser extent, perhaps, a reflection of the tendency in an era celebrated for parochialism and flippancy to dismiss strange and exotic substances with jokes. Among older people, it was certainly common knowledge that asbestos was non-combustible, for when Joe and Asbestos, the syndicated comic strip about horse racing, first appeared in the Baltimore Sun in 1925, the stable boy named Asbestos explained to the readership that he had acquired his odd moniker because, quote, "no matter how hot my tips are, they'll never burn a hole in your pocketbook," end of quotes. Such knowledge was hardly universal, however, for it was also true that a popular put-on of the flapper age consisted of solemnly assuring a susceptible theater companion that the funny-looking word on the curtain meant welcome in Latin. The fact of the matter is that although asbestos was linked one way or another in the public mind with fireproof theater curtains, many people thought its name was a trademark. Few people knew that it was being utilized in a wide variety of industrial products. Only a handful of medical researchers were just then beginning to suspect that it was affecting the health of the workers who handled it, and virtually no one had any idea that it would one day prove to be one of the most important industrial causes of cancer in the world. The properties of asbestos that made it so prevalent in industry are myriad because it is truly a magic mineral. It is a fiber of stone, yet it is as light as thistledown, as dense as the stone from which it is extracted. Its fibers can be woven. No other mineral can be woven into cloth. It can withstand the fiercest heat. No known heat can burn asbestos. It is highly adsorbent. In fact, nothing in nature can destroy asbestos. So when it is inhaled into the lungs, as it easily is because of its extreme fibrosity. When I say extreme fibrosity, imagine that in a linear inch, 1 million asbestos fibers can be laid side by side, whereas in that same linear inch, only 630 human hairs can be aligned side by side. So you can see that asbestos, which cannot be seen by the naked eye, but only under the electron microscope, when it was introduced into industry and when it became an environmental contaminant, could easily be absorbed into lung tissue. Asbestos was known to people in the Stone Age. It was used in pottery as a strengthener in pottery. The first cases of asbestos disease were described around the time of Christ, when the Greek geographer Strabo and the Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder described a disease in the lungs of slaves whose occupation it was to weave asbestos into cloth. The mineral lost importance during the so-called Dark Ages, although the Emperor Charlemagne was said to have astonished some barbarian Teutonic guests of his by throwing an asbestos tablecloth into the fire and having it come out cleaner and whiter than it was before. Asbestos came into prominence in the Industrial Revolution. largely because of its incredible ability to withstand any degree of heat. It was used in steam engines, in steamboats, in the boiler rooms of buildings. It virtually became an indispensable product in the steam era. And it also became an indispensable insulation, or thought to be indispensable. It was sprayed starting in 1950, between 1950 and 1970, it was sprayed on the girders of every high-rise building that was built in the United States. In fact, by 1968, when I started writing about asbestos, it had 3,000 industrial applications, and it could be found in virtually every car, plane, train, ship, home, building in the United States. And if you were to look in almost all of the buildings in Missoula, it strikes me that many of them, most of them were probably built before 1940, 50, they all contain asbestos. So demolition of buildings is one incredible way to be exposed to asbestos, and I'll talk later about the World Trade Center disaster, which is probably the largest explosion in the history of the world. When asbestos is inhaled into the lung, its minute fibers are very sharp, and lung tissue tends to expel things that that are inhaled. But in the case of asbestos, it lodges in the tissue. And then through a process called macrophage, the tissue engulfs the asbestos fiber. Each asbestos fiber that is engulfed has what is called an asbestos body around it. Now, the average asbestos worker back in the wartime, when 21 million American men and women were working in shipyards and heavily exposed, the average worker in the United States in asbestos textile factories and in the shipyards was inhaling anywhere from 800 million to 8 billion asbestos fibers a day. Some of those were being expelled. Millions were being engulfed by lung tissue. So it isn't hard to see how after 10 or 15 years, massive scarring of the lungs called asbestosis, which was the disease that Strabo and Pliny observed in the lungs of slaves, was beginning to cut off the oxygen supply to the bloodstream of these workers, and they began to suffocate to death. The first known cases of asbestosis occurred in Normandy in France, of course modern cases, I should say, when a French textile mill owner named Auribeau, and 16 of his 18 workers died of asbestosis after only 3 years. Asbestos became a compensable disease in England by 1928. It was also known very early in the 20th century in this country. For example, as early as 1918, Prudential Life Insurance, then the largest life insurer in the United States, was refusing to insure the lives of asbestos workers. Now you can ask, what did Prudential know that it took another 50 years for the rest of us to tumble onto? Well, insurers love to look at their actuarial tables. I often think of them as morticians of statistics. And they knew, looking at their actuarial tables, that asbestos workers were dying early and dying young. And insurers don't like to insure people like that because they have to pay out. In 1927, 3 of the nation's major insurers got together and warned the industry that they might not be able to insure them because so many asbestos workers were dying. All during the 30s, large asbestos manufacturers like Johns Manville, Owens, Illinois, Owens Corning, Ray Bestis Manhattan, Eagle Pitcher, et cetera, were conniving with the insurance companies to keep a lid on the knowledge in this country of asbestos disease. Johns Manville, for example, openly conspired with Metropolitan Life Insurance Company of New Jersey not to release a report that MetLife was supposed to be writing for the United States Department of Health about the injurious health conditions in asbestos textile factories, and MetLife went along with that. So the cover-up began as early as the 1930s, and it continued on and on. When I first started writing about asbestos disease in the spring of 1968, I met Dr. Irving Selikoff, the great epidemiologist at Mount Sinai Institute of Environmental Studies at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. And he became sort of a mentor of mine. He'd done a remarkable study, a retrospective study of New York and New Jersey insulation workers, in which he looked back on their exposures and what had happened to them. And he found that 60% of them were dying early of asbestos disease. He found it's rampant asbestos disease in 2,000 of these men. But even though he had done that, and even though his findings were published in the American Journal of Medicine, and even though it had held a world conference, he was being pilloried in the press, hounded by the asbestos industry, vilified by the insurance industry for daring to presume, let alone announce publicly, that asbestos was hazardous. The industry and the insurers would have you believe that asbestos was totally indispensable, that you couldn't do without it. So therefore, the first 40 stories of the World Trade Center were coated with Kafko asbestos, the girders, and after Mayor Lindsay banned it in 1970, the rest of the North Tower and all of the South Tower, the girders were coated with mineral rock wool. Unfortunately, because of some mafia connections in the construction industry, the walls of the 40 elevator towers were coated with asbestos material containing 80% chrysotile asbestos. The 6 million square feet of floor tiles in the two towers contained 10% asbestos. They were vinyl asbestos floor tiles. The operational buildings, the outer skin, which contained some vermiculite contaminated with asbestos insulation here from Libby. The total amount of asbestos, can't estimate it, but it probably was several hundred tons, encompassing untold trillions upon trillions of respirable fibers. When I first started writing about asbestos, I think it was Dr. Selikoff, I can't remember now, it's 35 years ago, suggested that I go to Washington and talk with a Navy captain. The Navy had a lot of cases of asbestos disease, and it was sitting on them because, as you may know, under the Ferris Doctrine, servicemen, Navy people, Air Force, Army, cannot sue the government. The government does not allow itself to be sued by servicemen. So the Navy was sitting on probably 100,000 cases of asbestos disease. I didn't know that then. This Navy captain took me to the Navy Club in Washington, and we had a nice lunch. And toward the end of the lunch, he said, he said, I'm interested that you're interested in asbestos, but I just want you to remember something. Just remember that you can get chest disease from digging in your garden. Well, I was new to the game. I stored that one away in the back of my mind. And about a week or two later, I went out to Cincinnati to talk to Louis J. Crawley, who was a senior official in the Bureau of Occupational Safety and Health. That was a bureau of the Department of Health, later supplanted by OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration of the Department of Labor. Louis Crawley and two assistants had been inspecting asbestos textile plants all over the country, many of them in South Carolina and in Pennsylvania. And they were finding incredible levels of asbestos dust, far exceeding the inadequate health standards that the government had promulgated at the time in all of these factories. But instead of warning the workers, here were these government health officials. They only told the manufacturers. I didn't find out this about Louis Crawley until a bit later, after some digging around. But about midway through the meeting, Louis Crawley turned to me and he said, you never want to forget, you can get chest disease from digging in your garden. Well, twice. Then about a month after that, I was called up by some people at Johns Manville, the largest asbestos producer in the United States, Vice President Harold Raines, I think his name was. And he asked me, he said through the grapevine he'd heard that the New Yorker was working on a piece about asbestos. So I said, you really should come down to Johns Manville headquarters and see what's going on there. We'd like to talk to you. So I said, fine. A journalist always wants to get all sides. And went down and had lunch in the company cafeteria. And somewhere during the lunch, either Raines or one of the officials, executives who was having lunch with me, turned to me and said, even though you're writing about asbestos, and there is some hazards to it, we got to admit that, you can get chest disease from digging in your garden. Well, around that time, it began to sink in to me that I was really onto something. and that there was a cover-up. And boy, was there ever. These people, Johns Manville, in their board meetings, which I later was able to uncover through some of the lawyers, were talking as early as 1930 about preventing English articles about asbestos disease in the Lancet from ever coming to these shores. They were conniving with the insurance companies, as I said before, to prevent adverse comments about asbestos from getting into government reports. They were influencing the government. Meanwhile, a vast reservoir of asbestos disease was building up in this country. As I mentioned, 21 million American men and women worked in the nation's shipyards in the Second World War alone. Down in the holds of ships, in the submarines, later in the nuclear submarines, where you couldn't see from one end of the compartment to the other because of the Tyndall effect in the light of the asbestos dust. I myself remember going into the Madison Square Garden, which was going up probably in about 1969, I think. And it was the day when they were spraying asbestos on the girders. And those of you who may have lived in large cities where high-rise buildings were going up in that era in the 70s, 60s, and 70s may remember the big canvas baffles that they put over the buildings to supposedly contain the asbestos. For every ton of asbestos that was sprayed on the girders, 1 ton escaped into the ambient air. So the ambient air of cities like New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, were just loaded with asbestos. And the day I went into the Madison Square Garden, you couldn't see halfway across the garden because of the Tyndall effect of the asbestos suspended in the air. So anybody who's lived in a city, and certainly anybody who's lived up in Libby, had got asbestos dust in their lungs. And if you have enough of it, you may well develop disease, or if you're unlucky. In addition to asbestosis, which I described as scarring of the lungs, which suffocates its victims, there are 2 other major diseases. There's lung cancer. And the reason that people who are working with asbestos develop lung cancer is largely through cigarette smoking. There are some very interesting statistics about the synergism between cigarette smoking and asbestos exposure. A man who works with asbestos but who doesn't smoke will develop lung cancer 7 times the national average. A man who smokes cigarettes and doesn't work with asbestos will develop lung cancer at 10 times the average rate. But a person who both smokes a pack of cigarettes a day and works with asbestos will develop lung cancer 60 to 70 times as often as people who neither smoke or work with asbestos. Now, the reason for this is undoubtedly that the fibers, which are so, as I mentioned, are so adsorbent, absorb the benzoate pyrene tar from the cigarettes. And then when they're engulfed by lung tissue, you can see how that would facilitate the development of lung cancer. And the third disease, which was often called earlier on the asbestos family disease, because the wives and children of asbestos workers would develop it, as well as asbestos executives who weren't actually spend a lot of time on the plant floor, was mesothelioma, which is an always fatal, always malignant, always fatal tumor of the delicate pleural lining of the lung or the peritoneal lining of the stomach. When mesothelioma strikes, those delicate membranes begin to harden. And they harden so much that they can't even be operated on with a scalpel. Surgeons who never saved anybody yet, but often operate anyway, have to chisel through. And the tumor grows inward and crushes you to death. So those are the 3 essential diseases. Now, asbestos disease, which was essentially to begin with an environmental disease, an occupational disease, can easily become an environmental disease. Take, for example, Libby. You have all those tailings outside the mill. The men in the mill, of course, are heavily exposed. They bring home dust in their clothes and expose their children, the wife who washes the laundry, the children who hug the father, but also the wind, which blows the dust off the tailings. The same wind that blew through the cities causes enough enough inhalation of asbestos to cause mesothelioma, which is caused always by some, even if slight, history of exposure to asbestos. It takes most often 20 to 40 years to develop. And it's a deadly disease. Bill Rabinace's father is, you know, some of you who attended the talk he gave yesterday, who worked at the Four River Shipyard in Quincy, died of mesothelioma. Well, so the lawsuits began, because they couldn't keep a lid on this forever, right? And the lawyers lost the first 10 lawsuits and lost big. When plaintiff lawyers take a lawsuit, you know, they do it on a contingent fee. But if they lose the suit, they lose everything. They have to pay for all the expert witnesses, all the testimony, all the time. And the insurance companies, in winning the first lawsuits, did something that they've always done in the litigation. They bring in, theirs is the duty to defend the people they insure, the asbestos manufacturers. So they bring 8 or 10 lawyers, each of them running the meter at $400 to $800 an hour, and they make that defendant, that plaintiff, be she a widow or a dying worker, bring in expert witness after expert witness to counter all the people they bring in. But something you need to remember about the litigation, because in the Republican Congress they're whining about the terrible asbestos litigation and how it's destroying American business and this and that and the other thing. You know, we got to have tort reform. Have been approximately 700,000 asbestos claims brought. They have been settled for about, so far, $70 billion, which is why the insurance industry is crying in its beer. But only a handful of these cases have ever come to trial, probably less than 200. In fact, I think it's considerably less than 200. Now, why do you think the insurance companies are settling out of court? Well, they're scared to death to go to trial, because the evidence of culpability, of foreknowledge on the part of the asbestos industry is overwhelming. A few months ago, Senate Majority Leader Bill Frisch proposed an asbestos bailout bill in the Senate. Oh, all the companies' insurers were all for that. Not only was it going to underestimate the number of future victims by several 100,000, as all the previous bailout bills have, but it was only going to pay them about 25, 30 cents on the dollar for what they could have got in settlements. Well, it didn't pass, thank God, because even though a lot of Democratic senators were for it initially, they came around to realize that this was not going to be a fair bill. But during a speech in which he tried to persuade his fellow senators that this was a wonderful idea, and boy, did the asbestos industry and the insurers think it was a wonderful idea, he made a speech in which he said that, well, I'll quote him. He said, described the Johns Manville Corporation and W.R. Grace and Company, our boys in Libby, as, quote, reputable companies that had been driven into bankruptcy because of asbestos litigation. I want to take a few minutes to dwell on the word reputable. I've been keeping a little scorecard, because I've written a lot about Johns Manville in my 4 books. But for the last few years, I've been keeping a little scorecard about W.R. Grace. W.R. Grace was found liable for punitive damages for outrageous and reckless misconduct in asbestos lawsuits as early as 1986. Guess what they did then? A few years before 1986, the company removed asbestos insulation from its headquarters in Maryland because of the presumed injurious effects of that asbestos on their own employees. Meanwhile, they had several warehouses full of this stuff. After they removed it from their own company headquarters, they sold several tons of the stuff to the city of Greenville, South Carolina, for their hospital, their school, their library, I don't know what else. And within a very few years, all this stuff began flaking off. Greenville found that it had been conned, and they brought a lawsuit against W.R. Grace. The jury down there was so mad about what Grace had done, they literally came back, half of them had tears in their eyes. They voted huge compensatory damages against Grace, as well as some $4.8 million in punitive damages. That same year, W.R. Grace settled out of court $1 million apiece on 8 families in Woburn, Massachusetts, whose children had developed leukemia. This came after a bifurcated trial, a trial with 2 parts, in which the company was found liable for having dumped trichloroethylene, a known carcinogenic solvent, into the water table of Woburn in that very neighborhood. They didn't want to go to trial to find out if the jury would say that they were liable for the cancers, so they settled $8 million, and of course that made the book Civil Action and the movie with John Travolta, which I'm sure some of you have seen. In 1987, a year later, up in New Hampshire, at the site of a chemical dump, Grace was found to have lied to the EPA. Well, the EPA wasn't happy about that, but in those days, if you lied to the EPA, you were if you were fined. But guess what the fine was? The EPA fined Grace the largest allowable amount it was allowed to fine them under the law, $10,000. It was like making them put a quarter in a parking machine. In 1989, they were ordered to clean up a toxic waste site in Nashua, New Hampshire, and they ran afoul of the EPA again. Then in Acton, Massachusetts, they filed a lawsuit against them for another toxic dump. And they were billed by the EPA $2 million for the cleanup. In 1994, they were fined more than $2 million for illegally, unlawfully preventing the EPA from entering the Libby mine. And as you know, just recently, that same federal judge found that the EPA was going to have to spend $54 million to clean up the situation in Libby and monitor the people who live there. I'm sure it'll be more expensive than that. So that's this reputable company. What a record, huh? Now, you know, we live in a country where the FBI is supposed to be going around after terrorist cells. Not doing too good a job of it, in my estimation, but anyway, they're certainly trying, as the FBI does. What is this company? Renegade? Certainly, huh? Absolutely. That's a renegade record. Killers? Bet. Terrorists? Well, depends on your definition, doesn't it? Seems to me they've terrified the people in Libby. What's going to happen to them? Well, under the present private enterprise system as presently constituted, you can't do anything to them except sue them and fine them. They file for bankruptcy. Under bankruptcy laws, which are passed to protect companies, the poor victims of say, the Johns Manville bankruptcy are now getting 5 cents on the dollar for what they used to be able to settle. For example, when the litigation was going on, before Manville filed for bankruptcy, a person who developed mesothelioma was getting approximately between $750,000 and $1 million for the privilege of dying young. Those who had lung cancer, who worked with asbestos, were getting somewhere between $500,000 and $755,000, and asbestosis was fetching $250,000 to $500,000. Today, these same people are getting 5 cents on the dollar. Under the nation's bankruptcy laws, the company's creditors are divided into committees. There's a committee of the secured creditors, which are the banks to which the company owes money. And then there's a committee of transportation people, the railroads, you know, the truckers to whom the company also owes money. And then, of course, there are the victims. Now, in the Orwellian language of the bankruptcy court, guess what the victims committee is called? It's called the Asbestos Health Claimants Committee. There's a nice juxtaposition of words, asbestos and health. What the hell has asbestos got to do with health? Why isn't it called the Asbestos Disease Committee? But you see, language means a lot because it tells where you're coming from and what the attitude of the government is and what the attitude of people are that allow this to happen. Why didn't newspapers point out that that's an incredibly Orwellian juxtaposition of words? So the companies are allowed to go into bankruptcy. Grace is now in bankruptcy. They want to be bailed out. Halliburton hasn't gone into bankruptcy yet, but under the Frist-Hatch bill, the bailout bill that narrowly got defeated in the Senate last week, Halliburton would have saved $6.8 billion. Amazing. You know, it's a great honor to be here, particularly to urge you to go see Bill Raffinasi's wonderful exhibit, because it puts a human face on this immense tragedy that has now taken the lives of somewhere between 500 and 750,000 American workers, a wholly preventable epidemic of disease. But it's also discouraging to have written about this 40 years ago and then be seeing it rediscovered every 5 years. And believe me, it's going to be rediscovered until the youngest person in this room is dead, and their children too. Because in addition to the mill that exposed all these workers in Libby, there are some 200 more mills all over the United States to which vermiculite was shipped. And to give you some idea of how these occupational problems become environmental as the ripples go out into the general population, vermiculite insulation contaminated with asbestos is estimated to have been used in 35 million American homes. The EPA has a plan, or did have a plan before President Bush's OMB got into the act, of identifying these homes and sending out a national health warning. Don't let your kids play in the attic with this stuff, particularly if it's friable. No longer. So you see, these problems are going to keep on coming. And the World Trade Center finally is another great example. Here's these two buildings that came crashing down. Asbestos, remember, cannot be destroyed by any measure of heat, pulverization, anything else. Anybody here who dies and is cremated, in your ashes, every asbestos fiber that you ever breathed will be found totally intact as in the day you breathed it. So all this stuff, trillions upon trillions of respirable fibers, came crashing down on Manhattan, and Christine Whitman said a week later, the air is safe to breathe. Her own Inspector General, after a lengthy investigation a year later, said she had absolutely no basis upon which to say that. It came out of President Bush's Council on Environmental Quality. The president wanted Wall Street to open up, the business to open up, and they didn't even, because they wanted to open up so fast, they didn't want to alarm the public, they didn't even require the workers there at Ground Zero to wear respirators. As a result, out of the 15,000 workers who toiled for a year to clean up the World Trade Center site, 9,000 still have serious upper and lower respiratory tract disease. Now, that's not caused by asbestos. That's caused by the caustic concrete dust that they breathe, which some people have said is, I believe it was Andrew, you said was about as caustic as Drano, wasn't it? Amazing. And in addition to that, you've got mercury, PCBs, dioxin, God knows what else in that cloud, and all that asbestos. So we will be seeing, once again, the environmental ripples. We will be seeing death and disease from the World Trade Center in the general population of New York, as well as particularly among those men and women who worked at Ground Zero for decades to come. I want to urge you to see Bill Raffinasi's wonderful exhibit because, as I said, it puts a human face on this awful tragedy. And it's so often so easy to talk about it in the terms that I have today, you know, pointing the finger at the companies, wondering where in the hell the Montana State Department of Health was, the Bureau of Mines, the State Department of Environmental Quality, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration of the Department of Labor. How Libby could have happened is a disgrace. It never should have happened. They knew all of these organizations that I just named. I also want to urge you to buy my esteemed friend Andrew Snyder's wonderful book, An Air That Kills. Go to the bookstores and get it before it sells out. And if they don't have it, insist that they get it in. Remember that books have the shelf life about the same as yogurt. So it's a terrific book. And it'll make him feel good now that he's back in St. Louis, or down in St. Louis, where he loves to be, I understand. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Andrew Schneider, who's written a wonderful book about Libby.
Andrew Schneider is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner for his investigative journalism. He has written for the Associated Press, Newsweek, Scripps Howard News Service. He was the director and co-founder of the Indiana University National Institute for Advanced Reporting. He drew national attention to asbestos exposure in Libby in a series of articles for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer in November 1999. Since then, Schneider has reported on the scope of the asbestos problem in the United States. His recent book with David McCumber, An Air That Kills, How the Asbestos Poisoning of Libby, Montana Uncovered a National Scandal, describes how government and industry repeatedly ignored the dangers of asbestos and how millions of citizens continue to face asbestos exposure. He now works for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Mr. Andrew Schneider.
Thank you very much. This is going to be a very short talk because he said most of what I had to say, and he said it more eloquently than I could. And the other reason it's going to be short is talking about a book about an area where most of you come from, where most of you work. It'll be kind of repetitious. I'm very happy to be here in Montana. I'm happy to be here at this university. This university, this program, is a very rare island of concern. Regardless of the exquisite work our other speaker has done over the years and continues to do, asbestos is still a secret. The majority of the world still believes that it's banned. And while it is in most civilized nations, it's not in this. Not because the proof doesn't exist. We all know it exists in Libby. Paul's documented it's existed in hundreds and hundreds of other communities. It's politics that prevent this material from being banned. Not only is it not banned, the importation of asbestos into this country over the past decade has increased 300%. Just think about that. Congress is trying to pass legislation, their fairness bill, because the asbestos problem is over, the lingering deaths are among the few, yet we still increase the amount we're doing by hundreds of percent. And nobody wants to stand up and have the courage to stop it. Paul talks about Bill's exquisite photographs on the human faces. And they are exquisite. I was a photographer for 15 years, and I wish I could do anything like the quality he's done. But this room is filled with human faces, faces that have suffered the same pain of his people in Mansville, New Jersey, and the other plants. And I've gotten to know them over the last 4 or 5 years, and their faces and personalities that I'll never, ever forget. And I continue to meet new people who are now joining this fight for Libby. This university seems to spawn them like salmon eggs. And the dedication that many of you are putting in, bringing your academic knowledge and your heart up to Libby to look at a problem that most would like to forget about, should be applauded by all. A lot of people asked, why did we do a book on Libby when we'd done 180 newspaper stories on what happened to that town, its people, and how our government handles asbestos? It's a fair question, but it's a simple answer. there's a lot more to tell. The stories that we published in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch did explain that W.R. Grace knew for years, knew for decades, that they were killing the workers and endangering the town, and said nothing. They knew the men digging that vermiculite ore out were at risk, and they knew they were bringing the risk home to their families. The stories the papers told about how Grace knew that they were pumping 5,000 pounds a day of asbestos fiber into the air over that beautiful town of Libby. The stories told about Grace pouring vermiculite tailings into the track of the high school and into the play yard on the elementary school. The stories told about how billions of pounds of this asbestos-tainted vermiculite was shipped to 750 communities throughout North America, where it again poisoned the workers and the neighbors. We talked about finding asbestos in crayons. We talked about brake mechanics across the country who suck down those fibers every day, even though the boxes on the brakes say contain no asbestos. Our stories talked about the ore from Libby that went to the World Trade Center. Far, far less than the amounts that Paul was talking about, but be proud, Libby's ore was in the World Trade Center. We talked about the government knowing the hazards of Libby 25 years ago and doing nothing, and how the cover-up continued in 2002 and 2003 as the dangers of the vermiculite installation in an estimated 35 million homes were concealed. Where the White House, both Office of Management and Budget and the Council on Environmental Quality, fought the efforts to notify people of these dangers. 35 million homes and businesses have this material. And what the people, the scientists that have worked in Libby have confirmed is that the amount needed to cause illness is minute. They believe it's far, far more toxic than the very well-studied chrysotile. They are concerned, as Paul says, about a child playing in the attic, innocently moving their trucks around that funny little fill, or the young mother going up there sweeping up the dust. They know that those fibers will stay airborne for days, yet they had to be pressured to notify the public. Well, they actually did. They agreed. After a whole bunch of stories by a variety of newspapers, by incessant work by Paul Perinaud and the physicians and toxicologists at EPA, headquarters finally agreed there was a danger, and they did schedule a very important major news conference. They called it a rollout. It's going to be on morning television, it's going to be on the evening talk shows, and it was scheduled for 10:30 on a Tuesday morning at EPA headquarters. The only problem was that at 10:15 that very morning, Christy Todd Whitman announced that she was retiring. Where do you think the reporters went that morning? They didn't go to the installation news conference, and EPA has done virtually nothing since to get the word out. We did the book because even though we did almost 200 stories, there are things that you can't do on newsprint or you can't do easily. There were stories that really had to be told. The Air That Kills just begins to tell part of those other stories. It tells part of the tales of the heroes and villains and what they did then and what they do now to make things better or worse. The book begins to give us a closer look at Gayla Benefield, at Les and Norita Scramstead, at a half a dozen other people in Libby who fought the battle. The book just starts to talk about the pain of getting a small town to accept the dangers that permeate it, the anger and scorn they faced in the grocery store and walking down the streets from some of the business community that just didn't want the bad publicity. The book talks about other heroes. It talks about the team that rushed to Libby the day after our stories came out. Bill Yellowtail, who was a regional administrator of Region 8, EPA, called them in and said, "Go to Libby. There's some crazy paper in Seattle has written a story about all these people being sick and dying. Sure, it's not true." Then he paused for a moment and said, "But if it is true, do what you can to help those people." The book documents the arrival of Paul Perinaud, the on-scene coordinator, and Aubrey Miller, the physician assigned to the team, and Chris Weiss, the toxicologist. I mean, we've got a sitcom in those three guys. Take my word for it. Those of you that met them know it. So you put these guys together with Gayla, Les, Norita, Gordon, a few other of the really unique characters that make Libby Libby, and just envision what goes on. Perinaud and his mob were told the same thing I was by city and county officials. There's nothing wrong here. We're not sick. That story's ridiculous. Do you see sick people around here? And common sense actually supported their argument, because if as many people as we reported were actually sick or have died, surely they would have known about it. Even in a place as remote as Libby, they would have known about it, and they didn't. Surely we were fictionalizing something. Surely we pulled it out of the sky, or we added a few extra zeros. But they kept talking. They talked to several of you in this room. I know it. They met for hours with these three, and she pulled out her black binders filled with documents from W.R. Grace. And these fairly sophisticated government investigators who've seen, they thought, almost everything, sort of sat there with their mouths open saying, what in the hell's happened here? Alan Whitehouse, physician in Spokane. Some of you, unfortunately, know him all too well. But those of you who have not had his hands on your body should know that he's a good man. Aubrey Miller, the doc on the team, went to see him, took Mike Spence, the state medical officer, with him. They thought they were going to see a charlatan. How in the hell can this doctor be reporting this kind of illness? It's just not true. They actually suspected that Whitehouse was a shill for the lawyers. That is just one of the many, many whores that could be bought to say anything in a trial for either side. This is what Aubrey thought as he drove the road from Libby to Spokane. 3 hours later, after leaving Whitehouse's office, after going through the charts of the people, of his patients, it's a totally different story. Now, Whitehouse, being a man of great ethics, would not give him the names of any of his patients, but he did show him the charts. What stunned Miller, what made this doctor race back to Denver to find Paranod was not the fact that the miners were ill or their family members were ill, but that people that had no relationship whatsoever to that damn mine were also ill. In the world of public health, that's virtually unheard of. You don't get that kind of secondary, tertiary exposure. Not with asbestos, they thought. They knew people were sick. They had to find some way to document how sick the community was. Pat, Helen, the rest of you, you worked hard with them in ATSDR. Somehow these three EPA guys conned the largest medical screening in the history of this country, done by the federal government. And they knew that ATSDR works at a snail's pace, a very methodical, procedural, we'll do this in good time pace. And the EPA guys didn't want any part of it because they'd gotten to know you. They wanted them there now. So they went out and bought their own x-ray machines. They went out and started finding a clinic. And they made it really well known that unless the real pros from the health department showed up, they were going to start doing x-rays. Well, that didn't happen, fortunately. I could just see Paranod running an x-ray machine. ATSDR did show up. And while they were a little bit cool and a little bit uncaring and a little bit aloof, the way they're supposed to be, that ended quickly. I gave a speech 3 weeks ago to 600 people in Atlanta at the ATSDR, and we talked about Libby. And after it was over, 50 or 60 people came up and said, we never got to go there, but we handled their x-rays. We handled their pulmonary function tests. Tell me about these people. We hear stories about how superhuman they are. If you see these people, tell them how much we really care. I had people that were near retirement telling me this Libby screening was the first thing they really did that they really felt was worth becoming a health professional. And they shared frustration about what's going to happen to those dark spots on the lungs on the x-rays they have. The book talks about the legal machinations of W.R. Grace, selling Zonalite Mountain, buying the damn thing back, same day throwing off EPA. It also talks about Matt Cohn, who's a really crazy lawyer on the EPA team in Denver, Jim Freeman, and some other people from the U.S. Justice Department who I can't name because Mr. Ashcroft wouldn't like it. It talks about the kind of efforts that they put in, this kind of commitment to your community, the community of Libby. I'm not going to say, with 2 video cameras rolling, that they broke any rules whatsoever, but you can bet they bent the hell out of them. They worked with a law firm in Kalispell, McGarvey, Hebling, and the gang, and a number cruncher, a number wizard from this university to actually develop the proof that Grace had slipped $3+ billion to a bogus company to avoid having to pay that money out. And they took them to court. How in the hell they brought that to court without the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington finding out is a great story that someone should find out. But they did, and they won. They got the money back into the pool. It talks about the $54 million that Paul referred to for the cleanup of the mountain. It talks about some of the really unique things they did to work their case. 12 or 15 feds, and including their paralegals, against an army of lawyers from W.R. Grace. It talks about a very gutsy judge from here with a very pithy sense of humor. His legal briefs are actually worth reading, and it shocked the hell out of Libby, out of the lawyers from Grace. book also talked about other Libbies. And I guess this is one of the things that really bothered me, because the people in Libby are exposed. The mine is closed. Much of the contamination has been removed from the homes and the schools. I'm not saying near enough, but I'm saying much has. But the mine is closed. The source of the contamination is gone. But it's not gone on the Iron Range of Minnesota and Michigan, where hundreds of miners are pulling taconite out every day, and that taconite is still contaminated with your own personal tremolite asbestos. And nobody gives a damn. And you go a few states east, upstate New York, and they're talc mines. And just like Gayla walked me through your cemetery, I had old miners up there walk me through theirs and talk about their colleagues and their family members who died from exposure to tremolite. The government knows there's tremolite in these mines. The government had proven it. Yet those mines still continue to operate with any chance of something happening being as remote as you might imagine. How many more Libbies are we going to need here? I'm trying to see what I have left to say that Paul didn't steal from me. The book does talk about the day the Twin Towers crashed. It talks about Les sitting in front of his television set a day or so later, listening to Christy Todd Whitman say, "The air is good, the air is safe." Listening to the health department tell the elderly and those carrying children, there is no danger. And Les said, 20 years from now, some sharp young government fella is going to stand up and wring his hands and just say how sorry he is that the government lied. The same day that Les was watching this, in Denver, Paranod and his mob were in the emergency center watching the same thing. Their reaction to their boss's protest claim of clean air, I won't repeat in this room, even with the college students there. Paranod had under contract 20 of the most sophisticated portable microscopes in the nation. He also had under contract, because of Libby, about 36 of the best analysts you could find. And virtually every one of them raised their hand and said, yes, they volunteer to go to New York. And somehow Chris Wise had conned up a charter, and they were ready to load these people on. They already had someone in New Jersey finding a place to set up these microscopes. And EPA said no. White House didn't want any more attention, and the White House surely wanted no connection between Libby and the World Trade Center. We went there after Christy made her talk. Things just didn't make sense because we knew what Paul had written about the amount of asbestos in those buildings. We knew from our own research how much stuff from Libby vermiculite went to those plants around that supplied the World Trade Center. Didn't make sense. So a photographer and I left St. Louis, any excuse, and went to New York and watched consultants, experts, academics, scientists who usually work under contract to several federal agencies go out and collect samples from apartments, from ventilating systems, from the streets, from the roofs, and analyze it and find, in most samples, very high levels of asbestos. We traced the work of the U.S. Geological Survey. Stoic, boring, colorless scientists cloistered away in Denver in some laboratories. Somehow, Chris Wise again had convinced NASA to lend them a plane and convinced the Air Force not to shoot it down. And on that plane was a device that we now have on the lunar rover on Mars. And they flew crisscross patterns over Manhattan, analyzing the dust. And they went back to Denver and analyzed the dust and found it was as caustic as drain cleaner. He's right about the number of people that have upper respiratory problems. It's going to increase. That's not asbestos. We all know that. 20 years from now, we'll talk about the body count from asbestos. But let's just talk about those people whose lungs suck down the pulverized glass, aluminum, concrete, dioxin, thousands of other pieces of heavy metal into their lungs. I had a USGS scientist, a director, cry as he told me this story and made me promise never to put it in the book with his name, and I haven't and I won't. But here's this professional who talks about finally getting some immediate knowledge that would immediately have an impact on helping people live better, longer, safer. They had this proof. He knew it. He waved this document at me. And as the tears streamed down his face, he kept asking why. Why wouldn't they let us tell him? And I went back to New York, and I talked to the doctors in charge of the firefighters and the police officers and the rescue workers, and I talked to the people at Mount Sinai, Selikoff's home. Simple respirators, properly fitted, used, would have kept much of that damage from being done. Okay? Every safety officer I talked to said if we knew how caustic this dust was, we would have gotten out there with a staple gun and put those damn things on them. And the workers told me, yeah, I'm macho. I don't need respirators. I'm not a wuss. But if I knew how bad this stuff was, my wife would have made me do it. Government had information. It didn't get to the people who needed it. Libby, government had information. It didn't get to the people who needed it. How much longer does this go on? You know? What's the answer to it? I'd like to blame it all on Bush. It's so easy. He does a lot of really bad things. What makes him so strange is he does it openly. His Office of Management and Budget and the Council on Environmental Quality. My wife is glaring at me. See, I have this Washington press card. I've got to go back there and be a nice guy. But I mean, seriously, he does it openly. They don't make a real effort to hide what they do. So they must not think it's wrong or they must not care, and I'll let you interpret which of those it is. But it continues today. The book talks about how much Paranod, Chris Wise, Aubrey Miller, and the lawyer Matt Cohn fought to get a public health declaration for this town. Little town up there, right? This is not something bureaucratic. This is important. They pleaded and cajoled and bent arms to have most of that county go get screened, right? And once you got screened and they said you had something, which insurance company in the world was going to cover you? They knew this. These guys that don't live in Libby, that got to know and care for you people, tried to put that into bureaucratic language and ship it to New York. To Washington. They cared passionately about this. I mean, they pulled every string they could, twisted every arm, tried to get HHS to do something, found every arcane interpretation of the law that they felt they could bend to meet the needs of the people of Libby. And you know, headquarters was this close to it. They really were. Marianne Horenko, who just quit Thursday, Whitman's deputy, she believed in it. Whitman believed in it. it probably would have cost less than we spend in one day in the Middle East on that war. That money probably would have provided medical care for everybody in Lincoln County and their families forever. And they really wanted to do it, but the White House didn't. It was a horribly dangerous precedent, and it hasn't happened. And you know, every time I see Paul and Aubrey and the mob, and I see them frequently, they still talk about that failure, and they take it personally, as if they could have done more, that they should have done more. The book has more, but the book doesn't have it all. The book will never have it all. There are more stories to tell. You people are living those stories. You people from this campus are making your own stories up there. You people at the Card Center are fighting fantastic battles that we can't really talk about, or Grace will get pissed. There's a lot of things going on. There's stories that need to be told. The nation needs to know what's being done in Libya. We've done our best to tell them how it happened. We need to tell them what's being done to fight this battle. There are people up there. If we don't put a human face on what's happening in Libya, both the people that are sick, the victims, and those that are fighting the battle, then it makes no difference. Don't talk numbers, talk people. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew and Paul. Let's take questions. If you are, again, if you're in the back, please feel free to use the microphone, and I'll grab the handheld microphone as well.
And I'm deaf, so if you expect me to answer anything, you really have to let me hear it, okay?
Know why Governor Roscoe, who's now running the Bush campaign, who's from Libby, who's governor of the state, has gotten away with this.
Well, I was talking to some journalism students here yesterday, both Andrew and I were, and I suggested one great story for these kids would be to corner this guy, Racicot. I don't know, I'm a French-Canadian boy, so I know how he should pronounce his name. I don't know why he calls himself that, but anyway, he does come from Libby. And he was governor, and now he's chairman of the Republican committee. And I would think it would be a great thing to corner him and find out what he knew and when. I understand that he claims he's not sick and doesn't appear to worry about anybody else. But that would be a good story. Maybe Andrew has something to say about that.
Just remember, he insists that he is not sick, but he has not had a chest x-ray in the last 30 years, so who knows.
I take issue with this idea that Chris Weiss, the toxicologist in Denver's EPA office, which is EPA's big regional office, is altogether a good guy. I don't know him that well, but I do know enough about him that I want to make put on the record a few facts.
Who are you, sir, please?
I was just going to get into that. My name is Tony Tudio. I was living here in Missoula in 1996 when one of the worst industrial accidents on rails occurred about 25, 30 miles to the west of here in Alberton, Montana. A chlorine car containing pressurized, a rail car containing pressurized chlorine derailed and crashed head first into another rail car containing cresols, which are sort of like polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And when those two chemicals combine, there's an exothermic chemical reaction which proceeds under its own energy. It doesn't require any additional inputs of energy. And it forms chlorophenols, dioxins, all sorts of organochlorine chemicals. Chris Weiss, who's a toxicologist and has been assigned, in EPA's Denver office to respond to chemical accidents, was intimately involved in that accident, which played out over 2 or 3 weeks before they even were able to stabilize the dangerous situation. And of course, the people in Alberton, Montana, and nearby environments were a gas cloud of chlorine gas and organic or chlorinated chemicals spread are still suffering from the effects of that. Chris Weiss, over the subsequent years, in my opinion, severely downplayed the health risks that these people were exposed to. One comment he made on the record was that when these 2 tanker cars crashed into each other, which occurred at a speed of, the train was moving at, I believe, 35 or so miles an hour, he said that these cars are designed so that this can't happen, he said, and then immediately admitted that it did happen. But I want to put on the record that from conversations I've had with him, he's a classic toxicologist. He believes that dose always makes the poison, that health effects don't occur below certain thresholds, and if you talk to the folks who were injured at Alberton, they have many more stories that indicate that they're not at all pleased with Chris Weiss.
Okay, I can't really address, well, actually I can address it. As it happens, for another story, I have spent a great deal of time going through 2 or 3 feet of files on testimony on that train wreck and the performance of all the government agencies for another story we're doing. I didn't see Chris play down the dangers of that exposure anywhere. The fact that it shouldn't have happened surely can't be blamed on an EPA toxicologist. There are supposed to be head shields on all tankers carrying hazardous material. Whether it was there or not or didn't work, how could you possibly blame an EPA toxicologist? But if you'd like to talk more about this after the session's over, I'll be glad to talk to you about it.
I think one thing you can say that you did say that I agree with when you mentioned that classic toxicologists at a given time will always believe that the thresholds that the government sets are correct. Getting back to the asbestos problem, what they consider today to be a threshold of acceptable exposure is about 5,000 times less than what it was when I first started writing about asbestos 35 years ago. So in general, whatever the toxic agent is, whether it be asbestos or any of the chemicals, as history moves along and more is found, you find that less and less levels of exposure will cause disease. And I think that's one of the points you were trying to make, which I do agree with.
And while your point may be generically correct, in the case of the toxicologists and physicians from Denver, their biggest battle, the reason that your congressmen and your senators here wanted to get them fired, was that they were pushing the threshold limits. They were saying it was completely unsafe, that the 1% limit is arcane, 25 years old. That was the battle that they fought repeatedly with headquarters, and that's why they were so much in danger of losing their job. So while you may be completely accurate on the general toxicologist, in this particular case, they weren't underplaying anything. They weren't saying the government was right. They were saying the government was wrong.
I appreciate that, and that I neglected to mention, I was going to mention that from the outside, it looks to me like Chris Weiss does believe that asbestos is dangerous and probably believes that it's dangerous at low levels. So maybe it's an interesting comparison, the way he's behaved in Libby and the way he behaved in Alberton.
Thank you.
Million workers, is that correct?
No.
Right.
The exact number is not known, but it's estimated that there are somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 American workers who have died of asbestos disease. There are some 700,000 claims that have been made, and some $70 billion paid out so far to settle those claims. The arguments occur when these people who devised these bailout bills, and one was devised by Millicent Fenwick, a Republican congresswoman from New Jersey, another by Gary Hart, a Democratic senator from Denver, and now this new Orrin Hatch Frist bill. There have been all kinds of bailout bills. The trouble occurs when they, under the influence of the insurance companies and the manufacturers, deliberately underestimate the number of future claimants. And of course, it's difficult to estimate the number of future claimants when you have a situation like Libby, with all that ripple out into the environmental area, 35 million homes, and New York. The problems just keep spreading.
So my question for you actually is, how many people have been affected by asbestosis or asbestos? Not just the workers, but their families, other people that have had an effect from the environment. For instance, the people in Libby that did not have any, did not work in the mine, did not have any exposure in the mine, but just had the environmental exposure from having lived in the town.
I'm going to let Andrew answer the question about Libby because he's more familiar with it. I can simply say, as far as the other environmental problems, I don't think anybody knows, for example, how many environmental exposures there were in Manville, but certainly there were hundreds of people. Bill Ravanesi could address this better than I. Hundreds of people who were exposed to the dust on workers' clothes. In Tyler, Texas, where I started out a whole book about the Tyler, Texas plant, Herman Yandel's mother, he was the foreman of the plant. She died of mesothelioma, as do so many housewives, and she was his mother. She washed his work clothes. I don't think anybody's ever estimated the number of environmental victims, but it is considerable and it is growing. And the interesting thing about asbestos, it is always far less exposure necessary to produce mesothelioma that kills most of these people. Andrew may want to say something about Libby.
Thank you.
I think I want to go beyond Libby just for a moment. We will never know how many have been sickened or killed. We'll never know how many people were sickened and killed because of the mine at Libby. Do remember, you had 10,000 workers thereabouts building this enormous dam, this construction project, the tunnel through the mountain. They don't stay here. They haven't heard the reports. They probably went on to their next job and their next job. I mean, unless you're a physician that understands what asbestos is and how to detect it, unless you're a patient who knows you were exposed to it and raises it to the physician, they're not going to think of it. When you hear hoofbeats, they're not going to think of zebras. They're going to think of horses. That's one of the major problems. One of the most frightening things I've seen in the last year and a half was a story done by a young, I don't know if she's young or not, a story done by a reporter at the LA Times. And she talked about the physicians at UCLA and a couple of other medical centers finding all of these new asbestos victims in their late teens, in their early 20s, in their mid-20s. Where are they being exposed? Do they live in homes that have zone light in it? Were they in the backyard helping their father change a tire? We'll never know. I mean, I really wish we could. Physicians should be made aware of what to look for, and more attention should be paid to finding medication and drugs that may be able to do something about it.
Even the occupational toll is up for grabs. For example, near Manville, New Jersey, which probably is a town that has more asbestos disease than any other in the United States per capita, the nearest hospital was in nearby Somerset. A prep school classmate of mine became a pathologist there, and he went through the records and found that all the people that died of asbestosis there, virtually all of them were diagnosed as having suffered from silicosis. Interestingly enough, Johns Manville built a wing on the hospital. So the pathologists that were there in the 50s and 60s were deliberately calling asbestosis silicosis. This went on everywhere.
I'm sorry to beat the hell out of this question, but it's so juicy. So bear with me for one more minute. I briefly met a fine woman earlier doing research on ethical issues involving a variety of things. And this very brief story, we talked about the miners up in northern New York State, the talc mines. A physician started finding numerous cases of shadows on lungs that the other physicians were saying, oh, he smokes, she smokes, that's emphysema, don't worry about it. But he was finding so many of them, he started tracking the fact that they in fact all worked at the talc mines or lived nearby or were family members of those people. He got fired. All the other doctors in town threw him out. The state of New York had the guts to hire him to do x-rays, and he examined 900 x-rays and confirmed through a secondary reader, this was a radiologist by the way, a secondary B reader, that over 500 people had asbestos disease which was not diagnosed as that. The state of New York knew that. And not a damn, and this, my friends, was 15, 18 years ago. The doctor was thrown out of the state. He's in Ohio or Iowa now. And the state of New York's done nothing about it. So we will never know, ma'am. Les? Sing us a song, Les. Forget the question.
Sing the same song. My name is Les Gramstead from Libby, and I want to elaborate a little bit on this lady over here's question because I think it screams for an answer, and if this is on record, this needs to be on record. And it has to do with Roscoe, or we call him Roscoe. This question was asked us at the Wilma Theater, the first of April, I think it was, and I didn't answer it, and I couldn't live with myself the rest of the way home, so if I don't ask it this time again, somebody, and it's not going to be me, I'll assure you, but somebody needs to corner Roscoe, because Rita and I and Gayla went to Helena when he was still the most popular governor in the world, and we had an awful time catching him, and when we finally did, getting a hold of him and hanging on to him was much like an eel. I was less than 2 feet away from him, and I asked him to come to Libby and help us out. As did Narita and as did Kayla. He looked at me like I was a zombie or something, and he said, well, we'll see what we can do. And I reached out, or he reached out his hand, and I shook his hand, and there was the eel again. So somebody in this country must corner him somewhere, because he's a rascal and he needs trapped. I just had that.
Far be it from me to defend the media, but I will tell you that a brilliant and aggressive television reporter in Detroit staked out the Republican headquarters for 4 days trying to get Roscoe just to talk about it, because he was doing a series on a plant up in the northern part of Michigan that had zonalite, and he wanted Roscoe to talk about why the government's not doing more, and Roscoe started going out the back door.
People up there have been waiting a while.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Mike Krill from Libby, and I have asbestosis. And first of all, I want to say thank you very much for everything that you guys are doing to bring this to the country, to let everybody know what's happening and what's going on and how it happened. And I believe through public awareness and groups like the TAG and the CAG, which I feel is a godsend for fighting for everybody, so don't shove that under the rug. And all these other communities are going to be asking you the same questions that Libby's been asking for 4 years, and hopefully they will rely on the people that have made, the people in Libby that have begun to answer the questions for all these people, make the government accountable. But I can't thank you enough for the book and everything else that's going out, because this is what it's all about, is informing people, get people educated, knowledgeable to what's happening, so that they have a choice and a voice to decide what they want to do if they're living in a community that's exposed like this. The answers are hard. I mean, they're easy as far as we know what needs to be done, but when you got a government that's at fault, this is where we have to change things. And I believe that all these groups and stuff that are forming and stuff, and all these communities that are going to be waking up just like Libby has, it'll take time, but I believe it'll happen. One thing that when you have like I said, you got Roscoe and you got the Bush administration and all these people who are, I want to say Governor Marsh, because I believe that she's just as bad as the rest of them, being corporate lapdogs, whatever. But when you got a judge in Helena named Jeffrey Sherlock, who stated at a hearing pertaining to the asbestos fixes from Libya that the state has no responsibility to the citizens of Montana to inform them or warn them or protect them from something that will kill them. This is, I don't know what the answer is. I'm so, far out there that how can a person, if government isn't responsible for people, then who is?
You guys had your chance. She ran for Senate,
Well,
You got to get people in there that'll stand up.
well, that's what we're doing. That's why we've been fighting. That's why we keep speaking. That's why we write our books. That's why we go around the country and inform and educate people into what's happening. Another concern I'd like to bring to your attention is also, my concern for the last 4 years has been children. Because I feel that, especially in the Libby case, it's a little late for most of us in Libby who've been exposed and are dying from it. My generation, my father's generation, and even my children. And so I come to a feeling of, well, what can we do to ensure that other generation doesn't live the kind of things that we've had to live with. And you can't completely clean a place up, and you can't completely make it safe. Like I said, I believe that education is the only way to guarantee that generation to not fall into the same as we have. Like if we would have been told, maybe these things wouldn't have happened, and we'd still be here. But in a report that came out in 1988 by, I can't even pronounce her name, it's W-U-E-R-T-H-E-A, she's a physician. She stated that there is also evidence that exposure to asbestos at an early age increases the risk of developing mesothelioma. So my concerns are that because there's a lot of mesothelioma cases in Lincoln County here, Libby, and around the world, it seems to me that if children are being exposed at an early age, like if you're born in Libby and you lived there all your life, and you've had all your life to breathe these things, that many of the homes and the town's still contaminated. It's not clean and it's not safe. Until it is, I will continue saying it's not clean and it's not safe. But my concern is that the children, if this is the case, that the mesothelioma, see what I'm trying to say is, when I moved there, I was 14. I began breathing that stuff when I was 14. Well, I don't know if I have mesothelioma yet or if I will have it, but my concerns are if this is true, then the people that we need to protect are the children. Because if they are being exposed at an early age through their life, and they're the ones that are coming down with mesothelioma, not asbestos.
Let me address that
Okay.
question, okay? A great British factory inspector named E.R.A. Merriweather was asked in 1928 whether a 16-year-old girl who worked as a spinner in an asbestos textile factory would develop asbestosis. And his answer was a simple one. Yes, he said, if she lives long enough. That's because asbestos disease, whether it's asbestosis asbestos lung cancer or mesothelioma is insidious and progressive. Once asbestos is inhaled into the lungs, and it is, no question about it, to some extent or other in the lungs of every living person in Libby, perhaps some more than others depending upon their exposures, obviously, that can never be removed. There's no medical treatment. So because it's an insidious progressive disease, it's going to be some question of biological luck. Now, what you can do in Libby is encourage young people not to smoke. Because if they start smoking with that body burden of asbestos, their chances of developing asbestos lung cancer are going to be 60 to 70 times the national average. So that's one thing you could do. The other thing you can do, of course, is insist. I doubt that the town is cleaned up enough, and I doubt that $54 million is going to do it. You can insist that there's a better cleanup. And, in houses and in the areas, I understand there's been quite an extensive cleanup. But those are two things you can do. And the other thing you can do to answer the previous part of your question is, as Andrew said, these are political problems. When you have a governor who, on record, is saying she wants to be a lapdog for industry, and then only after considerable political pressure decides to make Libby a Superfund site, you might think about changing the governorship. You might also think about demanding politically that somebody change the heads of these organizations that failed Libby so badly, the Montana State Department of Health, State Bureau of Mines, et cetera, et cetera. We perhaps need in this country a Green Party, like they had in Germany recently, which did affect a national election. I don't know if I'm going to ever see that in my lifetime, but it's well to remember that these essentially are political problems.
Michael, I just want to add one more comment to your specific question. I mean, Paul addressed them. The smoking clearly is key. The cleanup has to go on. But you've got Levitt coming to town in 2 weeks. Is it going to make any difference? Gee, I wouldn't bet on it. Nevertheless, he's going to be there. Maybe this is the time for the citizens of Lincoln County to get their heads to start working together and do something about it. And frankly, the kids are an issue. Do something with the kids. Make those damn picket signs say, these are our children. They're going to look at your face and say, hold a cute kid up, and you got lots of them in Libby. Make that a point. You got a great arguing point there. Make that one of the things you focus on when he gets here and gives you his 12 minutes.
I'm sorry to have to cut things off right here. We have some catering outside. I know that several more of you have questions. We can perhaps address those later, or certainly during our break. So we invite you out for refreshments on site.
That's cute.
We'll reconvene in about 15 minutes.
That's very nice.
Thank you.
I have no idea. I can't hear.